Um, Hello, everyone. This is Sue Watkins, the Climate Change Program Manager with the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals at Northern Arizona University. Thank you for joining the webinar. This webinar series is exploring climate change in the Pacific Northwest and impacts to tribes in the region. We're offering the webinars with support from the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station, and in collaboration with the research station, the Pacific Northwest Tribal Climate Change Project at the University of Oregon, and the North Pacific Landscape Conservation Cooperative. Today's webinar will focus on climate change impacts on forests in the Pacific Northwest, and it features presentations by David Peterson and Frank Lake of the U.S. Forest Service. It is the last webinar of this series. This webinar is being recorded, and we plan to post the presentations and webinar recording on ITEP's Climate Change Webinars webpage. I put the URL for the webpage in the chat box. Please type your questions into the question box on the right side of your screen. The presenters will answer the questions following the two presentations. Please mute your lines to reduce any distracting background noise. And following the webinar, you'll receive a link to a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to provide feedback and suggestions of topics for future webinars. Here's the contact information for me and for Christina Gonzalez-Maddox, who works with me in the Climate Change Program and who is helping with this webinar. ITEP's Climate Change Program offers trainings on climate change adaptation planning, webinars, a tribal climate change newsletter, the Tribes and Climate Change website, and much more. We encourage you to visit ITEP's Climate Change Program website at the URL listed on this slide, and please feel free to contact us if you have any questions about ITEP. We are very pleased to have David Peterson with us for the webinar. And at this point, Christina, please switch over to David. And while that is happening, I will introduce David. David Peterson is a research biologist in the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station in Seattle, and he is a professor in the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences at the University of Washington. He has conducted research on fire science and climate change throughout the Western North America. He has published over 200 scientific articles and 3 books, and as a contributing author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was a co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. He recently published the book Climate Change in United States Forests, and currently works on climate change adaptation on federal lands throughout the West. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Dave.
Okay, everybody hear me okay? All right. I want to thank you for the introduction, and also thank you everybody for checking into the webinar today. I would like to mention up front, I know that during these webinars there's limited time for discussion, and so if you would like to have some discussion, feel free to email me or give me a call after the webinar and we can follow up on things as needed. So I'm going to focus mostly on Northwest forests in my talk today. This is a topic I've worked on for many years now, but I will also expand the geographic horizon a little bit to the broader portion of Western North America. Okay, but first we got to do some boring stuff, so we're all kind of on the same page. There's been some changes lately in terms of how climatology is being generated for climate change. And so I'll try to go through this as quickly and painlessly as I can. First, the old-fashioned alphabet soup, and you've probably seen some of these designations before, but I'm going to go over them just real quickly here. The emission scenarios that we have used in the past were generated by the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, through the Assessment Report 4, which was issued in 2007. So you may have seen some of these B1, B2, A1B, and so forth, which designated different kinds of emission scenarios in terms of how much carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases were being put into the atmosphere. There are also a lot of global climate models that have been used. There's 30 some of these around the world that are cited, and they are used to generate projections of climate into the future. And then finally, CMIP, climatology, or Coupled Model Intercomparison Project, has been the standard. It typically uses a combination or ensemble of different GCMs to compile historic climate as well as projected climate off into the future, generally up to the year 2100. So this has changed a little bit, and so the new alphabet soup looks like this. We are now using emission scenarios from the Assessment Report 5 of the IPCC, and instead of using carbon dioxide concentrations, they're using representative concentration pathways. Big term, usually abbreviated as RCPs, and it reflects the amount of radiation experienced at the Earth's surface above and beyond the background. So the scenarios that seem to be used the most are 4.5, 8.5. Right now, we are at 1.6 watts per meter squared, or about the amount of energy in a Christmas light bulb. Still using pretty much the same set of GCMs, and there's new climatology that's been updated and enriched and analyzed really in a much more robust fashion relative to the large number of GCMs that are used. So all that alphabet soup amounts to this graph right here. So on the left side, you can see the historical data up to current time, and then you see the projections off to the year 2100. The area in the red zone is essentially a high emissions future. And in fact, that's a trajectory that we're on right now. The blue zone is low emissions future. And in each case, you see all those smaller squiggly lines. Each line represents a different realization of a global climate model. So there's actually quite a wide range here represented by these confidence envelopes. And you see the mean lines, the dark ones, drawn through the middle. Notice that these projections are quite similar until the year 2050. At that point, the high emissions future looks much more dire than the low emissions future. So again, we're on the trajectory of the high emissions future. Whether or not we can bring that back down is unclear at the present moment. But this is what the future looks like in terms of future warming. If you go with the high emissions scenario, you're up around 8 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit increase by the end of the century. So let's talk a little bit about effects of climate change on forests. I mean, one of the questions I get the most is, how will trees grow in a warmer climate? And there'll be a range of responses. Many of our west side cascade species like Douglas fir, red cedar, hemlock, Sitka spruce will probably decrease in growth to some extent because of a reduction in water and an increase in evapotranspiration. Now, a lot of these species grow in fairly wet areas, but we still have dry summers, and they do experience moisture stress. Our high elevation species will probably increase in growth. These are trees that are limited by energy, and so if we reduce the snowpack, increase the length of the growing season, they will almost certainly be winners in the climate change lottery. Our east side species will almost certainly decrease growth significantly, so ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, western larch. These are pretty tough species, but if you take a species that's in an arid to semi-arid environment and make it even drier, they will almost certainly grow less. Now, those sorts of things and the potential changes in the distribution and abundance of species will really be overwhelmed, I think, by changes in disturbance regimes in the future. I think this will really determine what happens to ecosystems. And this is a conceptual diagram that indicates how and why we have these pathways that already exist, from climate change to habitat changes, potential new fire regimes, and ultimately at the bottom of this figure to species responses. Now, mature trees are pretty tough, and they can tolerate and buffer a lot of global warming. But if we go through fire, it will reset succession and potentially alter the temporal scale of some of these responses. Therefore, this disturbance pathway through fire makes a much faster route for habitat changes and species responses. Basically, fire and other kinds of disturbances will be the mediators of future ecosystem change. And extremes really do matter tremendously in this, in our future for forest ecosystems. I've put up our old friend here, a probability curve. So you have the frequency of something occurring, whether it's fire, insects, whatever. And currently, you'd have something that down in the standard deviation there on the right side of the tail that might occur once every 40 years. But if we bump this forward, although it's a little change in the mean of that curve indicated by the big red arrow, it's a huge change in the standard deviation on the tail. So something that was 1 in 40-year event may now be a 1 in 6-year event. If that's fire, if that's insects or a pathogen, that makes a tremendous difference in how ecosystems will respond. Probably our poster child for rapid change in forests and woodlands is pinyon pine juniper in New Mexico. This is a sort of an iconic photo from the Jemez Mountains in October 2002. And a year and a half later, all the pinyon pine in that photo, which are turning kind of brown there, are completely dead, and there's a few junipers left out there. So even though this is an environment where these species are well adapted to low soil moisture, after a long period of drought, a threshold was exceeded, and we basically lost about 1 million acres of that system, at least temporarily. So we have to really be aware of extremes and thresholds that could be exceeded. Insects certainly play a big part in disturbance in forest ecosystems in western North America and in the Northwest. Probably most of you are familiar with what mountain pine beetle has been doing. Warmer temperatures have allowed it to increase its reproductive rate and to expand its geographic range across western North America. This is a map that shows areas with tree mortality throughout the western United States there, shown in the kind of tan and brown colors. You see the trajectory of outbreaks in that histogram on the left side, starting around 2000 and increasing in a near exponential fashion. And then recently, it looks like this has started to drop off, and it's been conjectured that that is simply because the pine beetles are running out of things to eat, namely lodgepole pine that is old enough and stressed enough to make it susceptible to attack. And of course, the best example is mountain pine beetle in British Columbia. This is an animation that shows the progression of mortality caused in lodgepole pine by mountain pine beetle since about the year 2000. So just watch this for a few seconds, and you can see the red, literally spread across this map. So this is all observed, and now the map goes to projected future mortality. So what we have here is something like 40 million acres of dead trees in British Columbia. That's an enormous change in an ecosystem over a short period of time, and really has gotten my attention in terms of how quickly things can change once we exceed certain temperature thresholds. Let's switch now to wildfire. And this is a little bit better done in the real audience, but I always like to ask if anyone has heard this statement. Wildfires are becoming larger, more frequent, and more severe. Usually most people in the audience will raise their hand that they have heard this statement or read this statement somewhere. What the data say is that fire frequency has not increased since the early 20th century. Fire severity may have increased locally, perhaps in the Southwest, perhaps mediated by fuel accumulation, and that area burned has responded to climatic variation, but without a convincing climate change signal, at least as of yet. So this is a figure that shows area burned by year on federal lands in the 11 big western continental U.S. states. You got hectares on the left, acres on the right, and you can see this nice U shape where it's high early in the 20th century, drops off considerably, then picks up again since the late 1980s. So a lot of people land on the recent trend starting in the late 1980s and say, hey, look at that big increase, must be climate change or something else. So what I have done is to superimpose warm and cool periods of climate on this graph. These kind of pinkish and bluish colors represent phases of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which is kind of like El Nino on steroids. It's about a 25 to 40 year cyclical warm-cool alteration that's governed by sea surface temperature in the North Pacific. It has a lot to do with what happens with climate on the West Coast. So this is just a correlation. It doesn't prove anything. But first of all, what it says is that fire responds very strongly to general periods of warm and cool climate. That's not a big surprise. But what it also tells us is that if climate change looks like a warm period of the PDO in the future, we know that we can expect a lot more area burned in the future. And this is a projection of area burned about mid-century for Western North America. It's based on that same empirical data set you just saw in the last slide. And you can see that there's some, orangish to reddish colors in the Pacific Northwest. Yeah, I don't take these projections too literally, but what I tell people is that we can expect probably 2 to 3 times more area burned on an annual basis by about the mid-century. So that's a significant change, again, in ecosystems that would affect our fire suppression operations, affect the economics of fire management, all kinds of different things. Usually, none of these disturbances act independently, and they also interact with various other kinds of stressors. So I look at global warming as kicking off a set of stressor interactions. I call these stress complexes. That includes higher temperature, fire, bark beetles and other insects, potential management actions, fuel accumulation, all these things interacting to create some outcome, which may be a change in species composition in some cases, but it certainly changes stand structure and productivity. This is a slide that shows interactions of disturbances potentially across the broad Northwest landscape since, basically for about the last 30 years or so for fire area and also for insects and disease. And you can see there's some pretty big brown and orange splotches out there. 30 years is a fairly short time. If we anticipate more fire in the future, more insect outbreaks, they could really start to propagate across this landscape. But again, I think this is the biggest factor to think about. So given all that, that sounds kind of negative, kind of gloomy. Are there some ways that we can manage systems to create some resiliency to a warmer climate? We're not going to stop anything dead in its tracks, but can we provide a bit of a transition and also reduce some of the potentially negative outcomes that might occur? And I have some ideas on this. And the first one is, I think in some cases we need some new paradigms. We need to start using some different terminology. We've become very used to using terms like potential vegetation type, habitat types, historic range of variation, and so forth. These are all static concepts. based on steady state climate. Even ecological restoration is that way because we use targets from the past typically to do our restoration. So I would like to suggest that we need some new paradigms, some new terminology that is more suited for managing resources in a non-analog climate. So let's focus more on dominant vegetation, functionality, and processes. Let's talk about future range of variability, not just historic, and manage for resilience, not just for targets of particular species or structures. And I think that if we can encourage broader use of these non-equilibrium concepts, we will increase the scientific rigor of our efforts and will also improve the probability of success for our management activities. Now, we do have some things out there that we can use. We've developed this guidebook for adaptation. Although it says here it's for national forests, it can really be used for any federal lands or any lands in general. We've had pretty good reception to this over the years and last couple of years, and we've distributed, I think, something like 3,000 copies of this around the country. There's a website that is run by the Forest Service that I think you would find quite helpful, Climate Change Resource Center. It is basically customized to provide information for resource managers. Lots of science, but made accessible and made relevant to a broad range of applications in both mitigation and climate change adaptation. So let's focus in now on the Northwest and think about what might be useful for us in terms of adaptation strategies. You could also think of it as just preparation strategies. And I'm going to talk about 4 things very briefly here. First of all, increasing biological diversity, so everybody's probably for that. But I'm going to be a little bit more specific here. I think we could start planting nursery stock that have broader genetic ranges than what we typically would do. We've been pretty well schooled in the idea of using seed zones as indicated by the map down here on the right. And we've been very good about implementing this across the whole United States. But if we can start planting more genotypes, including those that might be more resistant to warmer temperatures, we might have better success in the future. We could also think about mixed species in some locations. So not putting all your eggs in one basket. Landscape diversity, if we can have a better spatial distribution of forest age and structure, we'll avoid some of these big catastrophes like we've had with the lodgepole pine situation and mountain pine beetle. Thinning and fuel treatments can be used in some cases and oriented strategically to create environments that might protect certain resources from fire. I think it would be great if we could think of large disturbances as an opportunity. We tend to think of them as disasters. But if we can start now and develop strategies and on-the-ground actions that we can implement after fire or after outbreaks, we can hit the ground running when those things do occur. We can include some experimentation relative to adaptive management, and we need to get those plans approved up front so that once those fires or insect outbreaks occur, we can get things moving and not have to wade through years of litigation and appeals. And then finally, although we use risk assessment quite a bit, we don't always articulate it very clearly. And I think this could be very helpful in terms of implementing and operationalizing climate change. So we can at least quantify or at least estimate the risk of climate change on natural resources using a simple matrix like this yellow, orange, red diagram where we have magnitude of consequences and likelihood of impact. This allows us to track a particular resource, whether it's trees or fish or whatever, and project that through the future so you can see where you would expect your risk to lie today compared to what it will be in the future. Then you can decide if and when action is needed using this risk assessment to guide your activities. So if you're down here in the yellow zone, you can just watch it, monitor it. You get up into the orange zone, you might want to start thinking about doing something. And then if you get up into the red zone, then you pretty much need to start developing strategies if you don't want that resource to deteriorate any further. So just a simple diagrammatic, semi-quantitative way to look at climate change and risk to resources. 3 examples very quickly to show how you can take these strategies and downscale them to specific tactics. So if we just take vegetation, we expect that a significant vulnerability will be to have more wildfire across the landscape. One kind of option is to accelerate fuel treatment and accelerate stand density management. These are the kinds of things that managers have already told us in previous work that they would like to do. Take a look at water. We're going to have less snowpack. We're already getting that throughout the West. This results in higher peak flows in the fall and winter. You get flooding and you get loss of road access and so forth. One option that's been suggested is to design roads and culverts to accommodate those higher peak flows. So a very concrete kind of tactical suggestion. Fisheries. Higher stream temperatures are already apparently degrading habitat for bull trout and other salmonids. So that's going to be a real challenge in the future. One thing we can do is try to maintain as much cold water habitat as possible through restoration and other conservation activities. So just some concrete examples to let you know it's not all conceptual. There's some real things we can be doing on the ground. Now, this all starts with a science management partnership if you're going to do a good job of it, and that's simply a group of researchers and resource managers who are willing to work together over a period of a year or two to work through this process. We would typically want to have some education of local managers so everybody's on the same page, then conduct a vulnerability assessment. That's primarily a science-based activity. Work with the resource managers to develop adaptation options, and then finally take this whole big mass of information and hopefully operationalize it into management planning within a particular agency or management unit. We have done this in several locations so far successfully. The first one in the country was on the Olympic Peninsula of Washington with the National Forest and National Park there. We have also developed the North Cascadia Adaptation Partnership in north central Washington that includes 2 national forests and 2 national parks and somewhere around 35 different stakeholders, including some tribes. There's the URL if you want to check that out, northcascadia.org. We are currently in the final stages of a similar kind of adaptation partnership in the Blue Mountains region of Northeast Oregon. There's the URL for that website. In both these cases, they're looking at multiple resources across regions of about 6 million acres or so. So these are fairly big projects. They are scientific syntheses. There's not a lot of new analysis that gets done, but that seems to be sufficient for developing adaptation options. We have compiled a lot of information that we think could be useful to folks who are about to dive into the assessment process. This is a report that was developed for the National Climate Assessment Forest Sector that was released just a few weeks ago now. And we recently published this book a couple months ago, Climate Change in United States Forests, that is kind of a distillation of that previous publication, and I think it's a little bit more readable and user-friendly, if you will. Now, even though I have been a producer of a lot of this scientific information, what I keep hearing from resource managers is that they feel like they're drinking out of a fire hose in terms of climate change information. If you do a Google search on the term climate change, you'll get 1.1 billion hits, which is even more than you get for some of the rock stars out there. So this is just way too much information for people to filter it effectively. Nobody can really do that. But I'd like to provide this caveat that at least for adaptation, we can always do better on increasing our certainty, but we shouldn't let the desire to have 100% certainty keep us from moving forward with the adaptation process. climate smart management is mostly about sustainable management. If we're doing things that are sustainable, we're probably 80 to 90% of the way there. I think we've done much harder things in the past, like convert to ecosystem-based management, conservation of biodiversity, all these sorts of things, restoration, and focus on this topic of disturbance. We have to be resilient to disturbance. Everything else is kind of in the background. Let's pick the battles we can win, or at least have a chance to win. We can't do everything everywhere, so select the ones that are most important and focus on those. And we absolutely have to have collaboration, working across boundaries, because the flora and the fauna and the resources like water cross those boundaries, and we need some consistency across those boundaries to manage this situation effectively. So there's this old phrase that many of you have probably heard, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the best time is today. So, don't sit around and wait for something to happen. I'd say the same thing about adaptation. I sure wish we had started down this road 20 years ago, but if we start soon, we'll have a much better chance of success. That's it. Turn it over to Frank.
Okay, thank you very much, Dave. If people have questions, please type them into the question box. We already have a few questions, which we will have the presenters address after this next presentation. While this screen is being switched over to Frank, I will introduce him. Frank Blake received a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of California, Davis in Integrated Ecology and Culture with a minor in Native American Studies. In 2007, Frank completed his PhD graduate degree from Oregon State University Environmental Sciences program. He is currently working for the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station Fire and Fuels Program on tribal and community forestry and related natural resource issues. His research focuses on restoration ecology and traditional ecological knowledge related to tribal management and fire ecology of forest, grassland, and riparian environments of the southern Pacific Northwest and Northern California, with an emphasis on the Klamath-Siskiyou bioregion. His research interests include ethnobotany and fire management related to how fire affects culturally significant habitats or species. He has a research interest in wildland fire and management effects on cultural resources and tribal values. Recently, more of his focus is how tribal traditional ecological knowledge can be incorporated into scientific research to support adaptation and mitigation for climate change strategies. He is involved with research to support tribal food security efforts, agroforestry, and permaculture based on tribal land management practices. Another research interest is fire's effect on fisheries and aquatic systems. With that, Frank, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Looks like I'm coming across all right.
Yes.
Yep,
Can you hear me?
good.
Yes, okay, good. Now I'm trying to advance my slide. There we go. Alrighty. So I want to start this presentation off by first saying thanks, David, for that wonderful introduction and overview. It really sets a template for me to be able to follow behind with some more specific look at tribally valued forest habitats and resources. And again, a lot of my research area has been in Northwest California, so I have examples from there, but also throughout the rest of the Pacific Northwest. Part of that, we really have to understand from a tribal perspective what are the factors that are affecting those valued resources and habitats. And for a lot of tribes, that is particularly around their traditional territories and the resources that they use for ceremonial, subsistence, and commercial interest to also maintain their local economies and their traditions. So it could be anything from having old growth logs for cultural carving and also canoe transport, to looking at forest resources like different nuts and berries, as well as even the connection to fisheries, and everything from the coastal forest to the higher environment, elevation environments. First and foremost, I'd like to start off talking about the government's trust responsibility to tribes. And this is something that's important for both federal agency and state agency managers to be aware of, but also for tribes that they have their own cultural and political history that affects their involvement with climate change and how they respond to climate change actions today. There's the government-to-government relationship, and with that, it's important to understand that tribes have self-determination and their own self-governance. There's the federal trust responsibility that adheres to this executive order on tribal consultation, which is important to reach out to the tribes and find out what their concerns and issues are. Looking within that, you can have the executive order on preparing the United States for the impacts of climate change, and those are particularly different departments of the federal agency. And then the Department of Interior has a secretary order that's specific for tribes on climate change and provides only general guidance, but we have to look into there to see how those authorities and policies are being interpreted to play themselves out on the ground. So really we have to think about the different agency programs, their plans and strategies for how they're going to involve consultation and effective communication, and then really understanding how those are being interpreted for the different projects on the ground with tribes. So what are tribally valued resources and habitats? And again, for the way I want to frame this presentation in my examples, if you're a non-tribal land manager, these are things to consider. If you're a tribal land manager or a tribal community member, might think about the way that you would want to perhaps frame how climate change is affecting you and the valued resources or places your community and family depends upon. So when we think about resources, they're both tangible and intangible elements of the environment. These can be across broad landscapes, down to specific sites, objects, or even the state of mind or the perspective that tribal people are feeling as those resources change. This involves past, present, and then also future cultural knowledge and related practices to those resources. And really, when we think about natural and cultural resources, tribes generally consider those two the same. And really, we have to think about how those are going to be utilized to perpetuate tribal customs, practices, as well as knowledge systems, because also as these systems or resources change, so with it the tribal knowledge and experience that goes along with it. And then for habitats, these can be landscapes or places that support tribal ceremonial, subsistence, and commercial practices. We have to think about the biophysical or the socio-cultural factors or the way that the site characteristics can be described and defined. And then we really think about habitats also as places that support or potentially support a single or multiple resources of tribal value. And so looking at my photograph here, we have everything from matsutake mushrooms in the foreground to evergreen huckleberry to tan oak acorn trees with some fire effects on the edges. All those different resources at that site will be affected differently, perhaps by climate change through different mechanisms. So when we're thinking about developing a climate forest research and an assessment framework, at which scale to study the effects of climate change on these valued habitats and resources? We think about the tribal jurisdiction and the things that are particular to them. We might think about it from an ecological framework, or we might even think about it from a political framework when we look at land jurisdictions and political boundaries. But also how to identify and understand the impacts of ecological processes and those related disturbances. And again, David set this up nice in thinking about climate and also extreme weather events. We're seeing those. Is that part extreme variability, or is that also the indication and the beginning of more extreme effects of climate change? Thinking about the interaction of pests, pathogens, and diseases, particularly on forest resources, and then fire effects. And then how to identify and at what scale are the most applicable things to study. And at this point, I would really say tribes hold a lot of traditional knowledge in relation to the forest resources and their cultural practices in different forest habitats, but they may or may not want to share to various degree the depth and certain details of that, but it's also there as a potential body of knowledge to gain from and help us have insights. So in some ways, when we're looking at these pictures here, we have understory fire effects, but we may also see other things going on up in the canopy, and a lot of times it's the whole forest condition that's important to the tribes and the knowledge base that encompasses that. This is one of my a more sophisticated and in-work figures and diagrams to try to tie together processes across both biophysical and socio-cultural, and looking at how climate and geology, but also cultural practices, how that links down to ecological processes, and then what are some of the cultural processes that go along with that. We think about different disturbances, we think about productivity or nutrient cycling within forest systems, again, the hydrologic cycle, and then foraging and other cultural uses of those same places. And then really for thinking about a framework for the scale of that is thinking about, well, we have the region, and we have tribes, we have the landscape, we have different travel networks, and then we have the different habitat types, the resources, and the villages or the communities, and then we can scale that down to understanding both the patch or the stand, as well as tribal harvesting practices and use of those resources, all the way down to that culturally valued product or the resource. Thinking about long and short-term fire effects on those resources, really from the landscape to patch. Resource abundance and quality can change over time at the site or across the landscape. Think about these different patches of similar resources can be maintained and geographically distributed. And particularly to this, looking at cultural land use practices, working with a variety of elders and practitioners, there may be and there are cultural practices that can serve as mitigation actions. So well-tended and stewarded places can have an increase in their resilience to factors of climate change and effects. Think about the spatial and temporal resource availability. One of the things to be thinking about that is the time since fire by severity on that particular patch, also as well as the harvesting, whether that's a more mechanical or more of a hands-on type of harvesting, but that's really going to be focusing around the different traditional food species, basketry and fiber plants and materials, and then as well as for a lot of tribes, the timber and economic aspect of that for different timber use species. And how can we understand tribal resource needs, and how can those be integrated with climate change adaptation strategies, both mitigation measures and wildland fire management? Think about what are the tribal versus the agency or the public's zones of agreement for implementation, knowing effectively where you want to work and what you want to get done there, and aligning those values as well as the goals for how you're going to accomplish that. So there's a bit of downscale of the regional climate models, and there's different sources of information from the climate centers, from the landscape conservation cooperatives, different federal agencies, also from universities. Different non-governmental organizations have also done different assessments and looking and developing adaptation strategies. And all of these sources offer model information at different scales and for different types of analysis, and David already covered some of those. So, in thinking about some of the models and which are applicable, think about the biophysical framework of both looking at the downscale to your particular area and what are stated in the assessment reports. That's a good body of information. Identify which ecosystems and habitats are to be affected, particularly how those are going to impact the tribes. Understand the mechanisms of the change on the habitat or the species, and then be thinking about the synergistic impacts that affect those habitats or the populations of those valued species. And then for the socio-cultural aspects of that, think about understand the forecast, the model projections, how to translate from science the available information, and also how to evaluate the magnitude of those impacts on tribal subsistence and other related practices. And then what factors also may be synergistic or also have impacts to both the tribal community for both health and safety. And so if we think about increasing fires, not only does that directly threaten our homes and our property and our valued community infrastructure, but also it could be broader things such as air quality and water quality and other resources. Touching just briefly on snowpack accumulation, we're basically expecting to see that to decrease. You'll have the reductions in monthly median snow heights. Of course, against essentially the elevation at which snow and rain is going to be increasing. The warmer temperatures will likely cause more of that to be rain than snow. We're going to have a shift in the stream flow in the hydrology of different areas, and then that snowpack will essentially affect the soil moisture, the stream flow, and then the interaction between the vegetation or the fuel moisture, and with that the resultant landscape fire patterns. And really for thinking about it, less soil moisture, less plant vigor, and then the increases in the forest susceptibility to both diseases, pathogens, pests, and fire. And it's interesting to think about the way tribes also maybe evaluate. Here in Northern California, when we look to Mount Shasta, there's a cultural belief and practice around the white blanket of snow and using that extent of snow to predict how stream flows and springs are going to sustain, as well as also how much the plants and animals are going to have available for water. And so there might be also interesting to see for different regions and for different tribes how they indicate and evaluate the snowpack and the effects on hydrology and also forest resources. So tying back to this on the pest pathogens and diseases, each region has its own particular threats, whether it's forest beetles, or in California we have the sudden death that's increasingly coming north and affecting our forest. There's also other diseases out there, and if those are coupled with impacts from land use, then those are going to have, and other disturbances, that's going to have some factors to consider. When you think about invasive and exotic native species, are invasive, both exotic and native species. So in some cases, some native species will also spread, but we also have exotic species that are affecting these systems. And this is one where tribes may want to work with different researchers in thinking about genetically bred or resistant strains or different varieties of tribally valued species. We've seen white pine blister rust affect white pines and sugar pines, and so there was a breeding program to increase those. That's a tree of cultural importance. But also we may think about that for other species of trees and thinking about breeding resistance or strains that may be able to have more resilience in the future of climate predictions. Early detection and identification, how can tribal knowledge and Western types of monitoring be integrated together to think about what's being affected when and where? And then also for the tribes, which tribal ceremonies, subsistence, commercial, or recreational practices are associated with forest, and how will that change? And if there's existing mitigation or treatment measures in place, are those adequate? So Dave talked about the forest thinning and different strategies for that. Will that actually be effective enough to buffer those systems against some of these other synergistic impacts from diseases, pathogens, pests, as well as fire? And also then at what scale are these different types of treatments needed, and what's the scale in which they'll also be effective? So Dave covered some of this on the fire, so I'm not going to go into it other than a bit that we will see increased probability of larger fires in Northwest California and throughout the Pacific Northwest. As those fires grow in magnitude, it's not just only single fires, but as we saw in 2002 with lightning storms here in Northern California, we had multiple fires that really overwhelmed the fire management and suppression response to those, and that also impacted a broad regionally area of the communities, both tribes and the public within this area. So those are only going to be expected to increase, and we need to be aware of it and plan for that. One example here, particular to cultural resources, is thinking about fire's impact to those, both direct and indirect, and working with Kevin Ryan and others. I contributed this concept of the third order fire effect, which is really your socioeconomic or your cultural, and you have your tangible and intangible. And whether it's the direct fire effects or it's the fire suppression or management activities, you're going to have different impacts in different places of the landscape as fire is managed, both on the ground and at a planning level, to be thinking about where and how to manage fires in the context of climate change. And so it would be good for tribes right now. There's a program called WFDS, Wildland Fire Decision Support System, which is a good way for tribal managers and tribal communities to identify their values at risk and bring that into the both not only climate change planning framework, but also into the wildland fire planning framework. But particularly the WFDS and these values at risk is more to the wildland fire management. Thinking about the downscale of these regional climate models, when we think about threats to terrestrial wildlife, it's really going to be on species and the vegetation. These changes likely to include the amount of oak, pine, chaparral, or brush species, as well as montane or higher elevation hardwood vegetation, and also, as Dave pointed out, a loss of conifer-dominated vegetation as those become drought stressed. And particularly, how will changes in wildlife of tribal phenological importance be affected? A lot of tribal knowledge, in my experience, also working with different tribes, is there's different plants and animals attributed to the forest or associated with the forest that indicate seasonal changes that also relate to kind of a seasonal calendar of when it's time to get ready to go fishing or hunting or time to go berry gathering. As we see shifts both in the seasonal or the annual migrations of these different animals, that is also going to affect the tribal knowledge and interface with those forest resources. And there's a lot of interest in growing work right now on tribal traditional knowledge and phenological relationships of how things are changing out there. And an example here, the CDP&W Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment for Habitat Suitability, there's a link there. Looking at that and thinking about how those predicted changes are going to affect tribally valued wildlife or forest resources. Continuing on an evaluation, what are tribally valued resources that are at risk in associated disturbances? Again, this the ceremonial, the subsistence, and the commercial uses. At this time, at what scale is it going to affect the individual, the family, or the tribal level, or the community? The identification of and understanding the different pathways or the mechanisms of disturbance. Again, this was covered a bit, but if we have drought and we have pests such as bark beetles, and then we're going to have increased fire effects on those forests. What evaluation and assessment processes are used? There's different ways in which the tribal community or tribal members are essentially evaluating and assessing change. It's important to understand or realize what those are if the tribes wish to share and disclose that, but also think about what Western science, both in their research and in management, are using as part of their monitoring framework. And then what metrics are being used. So within the science or in the management, they have certain metrics to identify how changes in forest type, whether it's distribution or species risk factors, but also culturally, are they similar or are they different? And in a lot of my work trying to understand this difference between kind of a Western science perspective and a cultural perspective, it really does tie down to specific forest types and specific resources that are important to the tribes. And thinking about the forecasting and those different scenarios, what processes and mechanisms are going to be affecting those forest resources? Again, these same things keep coming up, but then now at this other scale, think about it from the socioeconomic scale, for the family to the tribe to the community. Also ecologically, for different species or those populations of species, the habitat quality that's going to be necessary to support those. And then also, what is the vulnerability of those ecosystems, and then across regionally, say from Northern California all the way up to British Columbia and beyond, how does such changes affect or impact the access to? And this is an important one for tribes who have ceded territories or lands that were relinquished under treaty right for settlement to the Americans. Tribes continue to want to have access to those traditional gathering areas, their usual and custom places. Also, the condition of those forest habitats are important to think about in the management and what's going on there with traditionally valued food items or basketry or other resources, and perpetuating the ability of tribes to be able to use those resources and habitats for cultural practices. And so sometimes we don't always know what's out there, but we have to work with tribes to find out, again, the forecasting of what's going on and what it might impact them in different ways. So here's an example here from the Pacific Northwest Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment, and looking at their habitat suitability model. University of Washington with other collaborators put this together. I think it's a good framework for resource managers and decision makers to get a sense of basic information about how species and ecological systems may respond to change. And if we look at these three species here identified, we have Oregon white oak with some range contractions and expansions, ponderosa pine, some predicted changes there, or we have also some other changes with, say, yew wood. And each of these at different ways are culturally important, whether they're for different food materials associated with a habitat of cultural importance, or for other specific cultural practices like carving and implements. And Schaefer et al.'s work has some information on that for others who want to look into that. Continuing on the idea of evaluation, how do tribes and agencies really identify and define resources? Again, for tribes, natural and cultural resources are pretty much the same. Thinking about a worldview from both the biophysical and the metaphysical as it relates to tribes and how they relate to those resources or places. There's both intrinsic and economic values attributed to that. And then lastly, tribes may desire to retain the right not to disclose or not completely share or reveal what or where or how particular resources are being affected, but may have other ways in which they're telling you this is how we're seeing it. And so really for a lot of tribes, the health of the environment equals the health of the people. And not only do we have to think about the older, in some cases of the forest, old growth as elders, but also the next generation of our seedlings, we have to keep a pulse on what's going on with those to have continuity into the future. And with that, a lot of tribes desire to have continued traditional management practices. They are going to hopefully share with you their significant habitats, but those are going to be for the eye of monitoring and effectiveness for what's going to be on for future generations. Again, access not only to the sites and areas that are important for potential uses and management, but then also look at contemporary management systems such as hazardous fuels reduction and thinning and fire management, also different adaptation strategies to achieve that desired ecological condition in the face of climate change. And then throwing this one from a Northwest California and Southwest Oregon example, how does the concept of climate refuge apply to tribes? As tribally valued forest species shift in elevation or latitude, how will jurisdiction and policies protect or affirm tribal access and the rights of these? A lot of tribes have rights and access to forest resources under treaties or executive orders. For tribal members, particularly federally recognized tribes, access will be an important one and for continued use, but that might be in conflict with future land use zoning, ownership, or even conservation regulations. So tribes are to be the last burden of conservation, and that's something important for managers and for policymakers to be aware of. And then for tribes, both as family individuals or families and governments, they may need to negotiate what's going on with the use of forest resources as well as exchange tribal knowledge and practice, and particularly the use of traditional knowledge and what they want to reveal and how the agencies are going to protect that tribal knowledge. And there's a different process there between what's openly disclosed to the public or to agency managers and what tribes may want to retain for themselves in relation to their vulnerability or how things are being impacted. And there's many sensitive cultural issues around this. Actions need to be responsive to tribal values and traditions, acknowledge a tribal regulatory process that may be different than the direction or actions taken by state, federal, or private jurisdictions. Tribes have a lot of interest in the equity and the being co-managers of strategic plans and actions around climate change. And then also, as part of the federal fiduciary trust responsibility to tribes, having the funding support and additional programs for tribes to respond and react to climate change will be important in helping them deal with it. And so if we look across the Cascades here, there's a lot of different resources in the forest that will be there, but even looking to sacred sites and other things, that will be important for tribes to work with agencies in that regard. And this last little slide I wanted to think about as we see more extreme variability, and sorry this didn't come out very well when I cut and pasted this in, but essentially we have increasing episodic events and the intensity of those. We have some information from the downscale climate models. As we look at the magnitude of change through time, each of the bottom colored arrows are intergenerational knowledge. That's the cumulative traditional knowledge of different family individuals through time. And as we see that variability increase, traditional knowledge may help us forecast and predict some changes to the system, but some of those may actually be further beyond what our traditional knowledge is able to even relate. And so as we see extreme drought and fire today, we have some insights through the cultural lens and cultural knowledge of how that's affecting those forest resources. But as we see greater and greater magnitude of variability within that system, traditional knowledge may have limitations in just forecasting, well, if we know it affects us at this level, again, as that distribution like Dave showed, if we have a little bit more of an increase, how is that going to increase the magnitude of effect? And with that, thank you. And again, there's a lot of information on the modeling that may be useful for tribes and for managers, but then really thinking about the magnitude of change and how that's evaluated. Again, what are the metrics, and are they similar or different between managers and tribes? And at what scale are those appropriate to be considered? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. We do have some questions for you and Dave, and what I'll do is read out the questions, and either of you, chime in as appropriate. The first one I'm going to read, it says, Frank or Dave, do you know of any research concerning the possible responses of culturally important plants to climate change? I'm not aware of anything, and it seems an area that needs some work to determine whether and how the Forest Service and BLM can meet treaty obligations.
I think that's all yours, Frank.
I'll take that one. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So yes, there's current work being done. There was recently in a climatic change journal two different manuscripts, one on forest resources and another one on nutritional foods. But there's been very little actual work that I've seen being done that's being brought to light in the peer-reviewed journals on the best available science for that. I have some studies underway. There's different tribes that are working with Intertribal Timber Council and other organizations like the Traditional Basket Weavers. There's the Northwest Native American Basket Weavers Association, and they're beginning to look through that lens of how those valued food or basketry resources are being affected. But that research is still in progress. But again, similar as you saw I brought out in my talk, we need to essentially get the scientists to, in some ways, we do need that best available science. And I think working with tribes to integrate traditional knowledge with Western scientific inquiry will help create the best available science to give us more insights on how culturally important food resources or plant resources are being affected.
There certainly has been a lot of discussion and hundreds of publications on the effects of climate change on fisheries, which is a very important food source and cultural icon in the Northwest. So today we're talking mostly about forests, but obviously the our watersheds and forests are integrated, and forests have at least some role in how they will interact with aquatic systems in the future to provide habitat for salmon and other fish.
If we look at huckleberries, there's a growing body of literature has been on forest management and fire history on huckleberry, but really as we begin to look at extreme weather events in the spring, early summer, how that affects the pollinators, how successful pollination happens, and then with drought and soil moisture and water stress on the plants, and how huckleberries are actually being developed to the ripening stage, and then actually at the time in the fall of gathering, there needs to be studies that track all the different angles of how that's interrelated. And again, that's some of the work I'm trying to pursue, and a few others are, but really haven't spelled all those different mechanisms and pathways, so there's more to be done.
Okay, thank you. Another question, how applicable are these forest climate impacts to British Columbia and Southeast Alaska?
So I did write a short response in the box, but I can expound on that a little bit more. I think a lot of this is very relevant to British Columbia for sure, in that there's somewhat of a continuum from Washington into British Columbia in terms of dominant forest vegetation, climate, and so forth. So I think a lot of that is relevant, and a lot of the information is consistent with what I've seen in the scientific literature so far. As far as Southeast Alaska goes, it's probably less relevant. You have coastal forest there, a lot of temperate rainforest, somewhat different species mix, different forest structures. You have a highly dominant maritime climate, presumably is somewhat better buffered against climate change in some respects. But with the exception of yellow cedar, which has been studied in great detail due to the phenomenon of yellow cedar decline, there isn't that much information specific to Southeast Alaskan and coastal forests. So there is a bit of a gap there. It's been suggested that changes in coastal fog could affect some species and influence their evapotranspiration, but I think a lot of that's pretty preliminary, and we're just unclear at this point how some of those fine-scale ocean-atmosphere interactions will roll out in future decades as the climate continues to warm. So I think that's probably the best I can do. I also mentioned in my online response that I think our Canadian colleagues are doing a much better job than we are on this side of the border with respect to climate change adaptation. They have some significant efforts moving forward at the national level, and they have a lot of community-based climate change action plans ongoing and more coming into play all the time. So I'm very impressed by some of the work that's going on in BC.
Okay, thank you. There was a question about the Olympic National Park, Olympic National Forest Climate publication. They want to know what the publication number is or how to find it online.
Yeah, and I posted a link in the chat box there that folks can take a look at, or just email me, and I can send you a link. I can send you an electronic copy, or I can send you a hard copy. So just contact me, and I'll make sure you get it.
Okay, great. And then another publication question for you, Dave. You were talking about adaptation strategies, and the person wanted to know if these strategies are in that USDA guidebook that you had mentioned.
They are, although what I presented today was kind of a synthesis that cuts across the National Forest Adaptation Guidebook, as well as some of our actual projects, like the ones with the Olympic National Forest and National Park, as well as with the North Cascadia National Forest and National Park. So these are things that were generated by resource managers, not by scientists, as well as you can tier down from those strategies to specific on-the-ground tactics, like the examples I gave about replacing culverts and accelerating, stand density management, those sorts of things. So those have all been provided to us by our management colleagues in response to the vulnerability assessments that we developed.
Okay, so, great. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, just a variety of sources, basically, is the short answer.
Okay, thank you. There was a long kind of question and comment asking about, let's see, where's that?
Fracking?
Yeah, about the emissions from the coal mining and fracking.
Well, I don't know a lot about that topic. Do you, Frank?
Nope, I'm going to skip that one.
Okay. Well,
sorry.
I think I don't know a lot about this issue, but I would think that the emissions that are derived from actually burning the coal and burning the fossil fuels would be the biggest impact on the atmosphere, because that's going to kick out a lot of carbon dioxide. Now, as I understand it, fracking also has some methane emissions associated with that process, and that could be pretty significant locally. Maybe it's high enough to be toxic to trees on a local basis. I'm not sure. And of course, methane is itself another greenhouse gas, a much longer lasting greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So I think I have exhausted my knowledge on that topic, but I'm just kind of guessing at the local effects that could occur to trees.
Okay, there's a question. Is there a good resource for obtaining various climate model projections for different areas?
Yes, and I guess what I would have to do is, rather than give you a long URL over the phone, I'm not sure what would be the best way to communicate that to the group here.
Is it possible that
you could send it to me?
Yeah, or their climate hubs, or like the North Pacific Landscape Conservation Cooperative, some of those different multi-agency partners have websites that have a lot of resources available online. So I would look like to the Northwest Climate Center, the North Pacific Landscape Conservation Cooperative. They have a lot of resources available at their websites that would direct you to the most recent stuff, as well as, Dave, you could say the Forest Service's PNW climate site.
Yes, and the Climate Impacts Research Consortium at Oregon State University has directed the development of the latest climate models, the ones that I showed you there. So they would have it too. And I can share some information on that with Christina, and maybe you can post this wherever the webinars are posted or something like that. Plus, you can whoever asks a question can also just email me, and I can respond directly.
Sure, gladly, Dave.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say we can post the URL with the webinar presentations. Another question, a lot is out there about the dominant species. I'm wondering about specific species, etc., that are important to tribes that have been impacted by overharvesting and potential listing as endangered, such as the Pacific yew, harvested for Taxol and important to tribes, but now rare and extremely vulnerable to climate change. Is there specific work being done on preserving these important rare species?
as from a cultural perspective or for tribal, valued species, the only way that I think some of these are being addressed is as tribes raise them. Then you have local ecological workforce training to where the forestry crews that are out there doing hazardous fuels reduction or during fire management are identifying those as a value at risk. And so the different treatment prescriptions will actually favor or have retention or protection of such species. There is little funding or resource that I know that's going from the agencies to the tribes, so the tribes are identifying those culturally vulnerable species and then specific climate research being done on that. On some of those species-specific distributions and effects, from Schaefer et al., I would go to that research and say, okay, this is what they're predicting, but then again, it has to be kind of translated and addressed through the tribal perspective of what's going on, that whether it's yellow cedar or yew, and other important tree species. So there isn't specific work that I'm aware of that are done, in part because in some ways you can go through the ethnographic information and see which culturally important species there are and have to crosswalk that to the vulnerability assessments, and then also for tribes to weigh in and contribute their knowledge and information about how they would see certain prescriptions or certain actions taken that would favor the protection of those species.
Okay, thank you. I believe that's all the questions that were typed in. So with that, I just want to thank Dave and Frank again for giving these great presentations on the webinar and taking the time to speak with us. And ITEP will be posting the webinar recording and presentations as soon as possible. It may take a week or two, but we do plan to get them posted. And thank you very much, everyone, for participating in the webinar. And with that, we will end the webinar.